All right, I would like to introduce our moderator for tonight's conversation. Natalie Bazil is the author of the novel Queen Sugar, which was a San Francisco Chronicle Best Book of 2014, longlisted for the Crooks Corner Southern Book Prize, and nominated for an NAACP Image Award and adapted for television. She's also the author of We Are Each Other's Harvest, celebrating African American farmers, land, and legacy. Bazil holds an MA in Afro-American Studies from UCLA and is a graduate of Warren Wilson College's MFA program for writers. And she is joining us from San Francisco. Welcome, Natalie.
Thank you so much, Claire.
Yes. And now for our featured author. Clyde W. Ford was born in New York City. He's the author of 13 works of fiction and nonfiction. His memoir, Think Black, won the Washington State Book Award in Creative Nonfiction in 2021. In 2006, Ford received the Zora Neale Hurston Richard Wright Award in African American Fiction. Ford is currently a speaker for Humanities Washington, where he presents a program entitled Let's Talk About Race around the state. Clyde has participated in hundreds of media interviews and has appeared on The Oprah Winfrey Show, New Dimensions Radio, and National Public Radio. He lives here in Bellingham, Washington, and he's here to present his latest book, this gorgeous book right here, Of Blood and Sweat, Black Lives and the Making of White Power and Wealth. Please welcome Natalie Bazil and Clyde Ford.
Thank you, Claire.
Thank you, Claire. Well, hello, Clyde. How are
Hi,
you?
Natalie. I am so excited to be on a program with you and to have you in conversation. I can't tell you how exciting this is.
Well, the feeling is mutual. You know, we've gotten to know each other in the last few years as we've been working on these books, kind of with, you know, overlapping themes. And so it's a real pleasure. And congratulations, first of all. Congratulations on a really important and compelling work. I want to just start by diving right in and you know, asking you kind of that question that is definitely part of the larger cultural conversation we're having in this moment. From Texas to Tennessee to Idaho and Iowa, school boards and state houses across the country are enacting laws really in response to this idea that schools are teaching critical race theory. So my first question for you is, what does your book have to say about critical race theory? Is that an element in your book? And kind of let's get into it. Let's hear your thoughts on that topic.
First of all, thank you. That's a great question. And it is a question that comes up. In fact, for Black authors, I think there's some belief that anything a Black author writes about has something to do with critical race theory. So let me say right out of the gate that Of Blood and Sweat, Black Lives and the Making of White Power and Wealth is not a book about critical race theory. And here's why. I think it's really important, Natalie, to distinguish between theory and historical truths. And that's a distinction with an important difference that many people on both sides of this issue around critical race theory do not make. A theory is a way you look at facts. Historical truths are sets of facts that you have the ability to document. Of Blood and Sweat is a book about historical truths. And interestingly enough, some of those truths support the ideas of critical race theory. But Of Blood and Sweat is not a book about critical race theory. Let me be really clear about what I mean about the difference between theory and historical truth. So in my book Of Blood and Sweat, for example, I write about the fact that Thomas Jefferson used his slaves, the enslaved people he had, as collateral for the debt that he owed to creditors in the Netherlands and in England. Now, that's a historical fact. And the reason I say it's a historical fact is that I have on my website, for example, the actual documents written in his hand that say to his creditors, look, I owe you all of this money and I will pay you back. And I promise to pay you back because I am using as collateral against that debt these slaves, these people who are my slaves or I'm enslaving. And he's got a list of the names. So that's historical truth. Now, what we make of that, how we analyze that, how we look at that, that's theory. And the two things are very different. So, certainly most non-college educational institutions, kindergarten through high school, they're not teaching their students critical race theory. They're teaching them history. And history is not the same as critical race theory. Although I have to say that distinction is not made by people like Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, or Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas, and certainly not made by individuals like the former President Trump, who just lump, for political reasons, everything that has anything remotely to do about race and racism into critical race theory. I just think it's laughable that DeSantis is poised to sign a bill into law that makes it illegal to do anything that might make someone feel discomfort over the topic of race and racism. How do you legislate what somebody feels? That's how bizarre this discourse has gotten. And I think, by the way, I think it is really important also to understand that critical race theory started as an academic theory at Harvard University, Derek Bell and others in the 1970s. And it was seized by the right, conservative leaning folks in this country, in particular because it seemed like a convenient catch-all to stand against the Black Lives Matter movement. And as Black Lives Matter began to really surge, critical race theory surged as opposing the goals and objectives of Black Lives Matter. But the truth of the fact is, the matter is that critical race theory is simply a legal theory that looks at historical facts and tries to make some sense of the legality of why we're living in a country in which there's such great disparity in so many areas. That is not the same as teaching about history.
Well, and so let's go back a step.
Yeah.
I would love to hear you describe what led you to write this book in this moment. I know, you are a historian, and I would just love to hear more about what were you thinking about? What inspired this topic right now? Because it is very timely. And, we're going to get into some of the other questions later, but I would just like to, if you would give our audience some background about what compelled you to write this book and tackle this subject in the first place.
Yeah, it's really funny, Natalie. I wish I could say that I was so prescient that I wrote this book knowing that we were in this particular historical moment. But the truth of the matter is I started it before critical race theory had even popped up on the map. And I was telling some folks earlier that the first time I began to look into this area was actually over 50 years ago as a young student at Wesleyan University, when I did my senior thesis on Africans in Virginia from 1619 to 1700. So I have been interested in thinking about this for many years. I've had the opportunity to be a student of some really luminary historians like Vincent Harding and Leroy Bennett. And because of all this, I just got to a point when my editor, Tracy Sherrod, who published Think Black, said to me, I think there might be a really interesting book about labor in America. And I know Tracy's published your book, so you know Tracy, and Tracy has this marvelous way of just kind of looking at you and saying, I think, and what she's really saying is, please do this. And I said to Tracy, well, I do think there's an interesting book about labor in America, but I'm not sure it's the book that you're thinking about. I think it's a book that goes right back to pre-colonial times and looks at how Black labor, in particular, the labor of enslaved people, built the major institutions of this country. And she said, that's the book I want you to write. So it really started over lunch, probably 2018, 2019. And it was because of that that I thought, well, now's finally the time to dust off this thesis, which I have still in my file cabinet, written on a typewriter because we didn't have computers in those days, and to see if there isn't a way to flesh out this story and to tell it in a way that might be different from how most people think about history. I wanted to write a story which would be more personal, more creative. And what occurred to me, largely from working with my mentors and friends, Vincent Harding and Lerone Bennett, was to tell this story by telling it through the eyes of individuals, imagining what it would be like to live through them the stories of these various historical epochs that I talk about in Of Blood and Sweat. So I really tried to do that where I could. And I started by telling the story of Anthony and Isabella, Christianized names for two of the Africans on that ship that docked off of Point Comfort in Virginia in 1619, who went on later to be married, were enslaved on the same Tucker plantation, but who gave birth to the first African-American child born in this country. So I thought, well, this is a wonderful way to tell that story, because in a certain way, they are the progenitors of all of the folks who came after them, if not genetically, then certainly metaphorically. Mm-hmm. And I tried to then take an individual in each epic and use their life story as best we could determine it as a lens to talk about the larger issues of that period.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, and so now I'm bursting with questions. Right. You know, even more than the ones I had expected to ask you. So I have two questions, and I'll repeat them. But the first question is, you mentioned this date 1619, and that has become a date in the last few years that has, like you said, it is a date that is rooted in historical fact, but it has become politicized, right? And something for people to react against. It's a date that definitely looms large. But you make the argument, and you make the argument in the book that, well, I should say, many people have come to see that date as the date that slavery began in this country. But you actually don't. Am I correct about that?
That's correct. That is correct.
So walk us through that. Walk us through your argument, and then I have a follow-up question about institutions. But let's talk about 1619 for a minute.
Yeah. So I think the best way to look at that argument is to go back to 2019, I think it was. Then Governor Northam in Virginia, who got in trouble for having been discovered as having blackface on at a party, was on the Gayle King show, and they were talking, and Ralph Northam, I think that's his first name, said, in 1619, when Africans were on a ship anchored off Old Point Comfort and got off as indentured servants, and Gayle King interjected and said, wait, you mean as enslaved people, not indentured servants. And I thought to myself at that moment, both of them are right and both of them are wrong. And the situation is this. Look, we're in 1619. There is no system of chattel slavery in the United States that those 22 or more Africans who got off of that ship anchored off Point Comfort in Virginia just stepped into. it's not like they stepped into a society that had already figured out we are going to be a society which condones and has laws in place in order to enslave people, and have some people with dark skins enslaved and others not. It's not the way it worked. They stepped off a boat into a lot of confusion. They were hauled off the boat and exchanged by the captain of that boat. And there's a wonderful story about the captain of the White Lion, which was the ship which brought them to Virginia. But they stepped off of that boat into a society of great confusion. They stepped off of that boat into a society which was not sure which road it would take moving forward. There were choices that were made. And in the period between 1619 and about 1660, the choices that were made had everything to do about how America would become a society which recognized a difference between people based on race. It didn't have to go that way. There were other choices. And that's why I say, if you only say that slavery started in 1619, you miss one of the most important periods in this country where everything that we can learn about what choices were made and why is skipped. Learning why those choices were made, how they were made, what institutions they impacted, really gives this much fuller story about the role that people of African descent played in the history of this country and the founding of the great institutions of this country, that they never really participated in. That's why that period was so important to me. And that's why I do not believe, and I think most historians who have really studied this period would probably agree with me, that Africans stepped off as enslaved human beings. Now, that doesn't mean they stepped off at the same category as white indentured servants, but it is fascinating. And I love these first 3 chapters of the book, which talk about this period, because you can see each decision that is made, the laws that result from that, the institutions that are created from that decision to enslave African people and to enslave Native Americans, by the way, as well, so that by 1664, when you've got books, laws on the books which specifically identify people as enslaved and those who are not, there are religious institutions to support that. There are economic institutions to support that. There are agricultural institutions that support that. There are legal institutions that have changed simply to support the idea that some people would be enslaved and some people would not. That's why it's important to know that. That's why this period is so critical, because it forms the basis of our country. And I have to say, along with my dear late friend Lerone Bennett, it also tells us the roads that were not taken. That was his phrase, the road not taken. And the roads not taken are the very roads that I believe we really want to take in this country. The road toward equity and justice and equality. Those were the roads that were not taken in those early formative years of America. And we have the country we have now because of that.
Right. Well, and so you've mentioned institutions a number of times, and that's, you know, part of the thesis of this book is the role that African Americans, enslaved people, enslaved Black people participated in, played in creating institutions. So can you talk a little bit about, you know, because that can be kind of an abstract word when it actually refers to things that are very concrete. So can you share a little bit about what you have in mind when you use that word institutions?
Absolutely. And by the way, I'm sipping not from a micro brew. I wish it was a micro brew. This is a mushroom root beer made of mushrooms that I get at the co-op.
Ah, very good.
Um,
Well, mushrooms are good for the brain, so
that's the idea. I
you're
want to
on
be
it.
sharp for this.
Yeah.
You know, I think the best example I can give you, Natalie, and one that really pulls together the institutions of religion and the legal system is this. Law in the early colonies was based on English law that came over from Britain and England, because Virginia was a colony settled by the English. It was a colony which the colonizers came over from the Virginia Company, which was a London-based company. Now, British and English law in the 1600s had it that the social status of an individual followed the status of the father. So in Britain and in England, if your father was a serf, let's say, and it was called the Village laws, if your father was a serf, you were also a serf in that category. Now, come over to the United States, and there's a woman named Elizabeth Key. For those of you interested further, Johnny Depp is actually a distant relative of this Virginia Key. Virginia Key is a mixed race woman born of a white man and a black woman who may have been his slave. In 1650 or something, Elizabeth Key sues for her freedom, takes a case to court. And basically she says, look, my father was free, so I can't be held a slave. And she also said, I'm Christian. And at the time, at least, the religious beliefs that had come over from England were that Christians could not hold other Christians as enslaved people. So on the basis of those two facts and a couple of others, she actually won the case. I mean, it was the lower courts rejected it. She appealed it to the Virginia Supreme Court, the General Assembly, but she won the case. The moment she won the case, laws in Maryland and Virginia were changed so that the status of a child no longer followed the status of the father, but followed the status of the mother. That is a clear example of how a legal institution in the United States was changed in order to support slavery. And the other thing that happened in, again, Maryland and Virginia, was that the laws were changed so if you were baptized, it didn't matter. The status of your baptism did not make a difference in terms of the status of whether you were enslaved or not. Those are two examples of institutional change that creates a novel institution in America, different from the institution that it came from, simply because the powers that be needed to support slavery. And that's why I say, trace any American institution back, any major American institution back to its roots. And it was either created based on the labor of African descent or created to control people of African descent. That's what I mean.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating. That's really, you know, when you step back and you look at, like you're saying, how the laws in this country, the foundation was created to, often in response to the presence of enslaved Africans here. You know, you see all of the very deliberate, intentional ways that this foundation was created to maintain this system of chattel slavery. It's fascinating, just fascinating.
It's fascinating, it's frustrating,
Yes.
it's sad,
yeah,
and it is unrecognized and unwelcome to even have this kind of discussion. Listen, that same idea that you change laws to support slavery found its way directly into the Constitution. into the Declaration of Independence, into the Bill of Rights. Now, a lot of people don't like it when I say that. I didn't just decide that. I didn't just decide, oh, that's maybe an interesting theory that, the Constitution of the United States is this racist document. I went back to the original discussions in 1789, the Second Constitutional Convention, and read the discourse between Southern members and Northern members. And as I read those, and I'm not the first person to do this, what becomes so apparent is the North was worried about losing the South after the Revolutionary War because the South wanted to support and maintain a system of chattel slavery. So just about at every turn, the North appeased the South, basically saying, okay, we'll let you have it. We won't mention the word slave in the Constitution, and it is not mentioned, but wink, wink, nod, nod. That's what this clause means. That's what this clause means. Oh, the Interstate Commerce Clause, I know you're worried that it means if you have a slave with you, an enslaved person, and take them to a state that doesn't recognize slavery, that there's a chance that that person might be free. Don't worry about it. We'll shift that clause so that it recognizes the laws in your home state. Don't have to mention slavery, but the effect was, and the discussion was between Northern and Southern delegates, let's make sure that we have baked into the Constitution these ideas which will not free our slaves if we, happen to travel north. Yeah. I mean, the same thing is true with the 3/5 clause, right? Northern delegates were worried that if you counted all of the folks who actually lived in the South, what the Southern delegates wanted to do was count everybody, even the people they enslaved. What the Northern delegates were worried about is, oh my God, if we do that, we're going to be voted out of everything. Mm-hmm. So the formula, right, is the 3/5 formula. They come up with the 3/5 formula. Yeah. That is baked into the Constitution. Yes, it was repealed, but the problem is it wasn't repealed everywhere. And where it wasn't repealed, we are dealing with right now. It was not repealed for the Electoral College, which is still based on this bizarre formula of a 3/5, that African Americans are worth or count only for 3/5 of a person. We are dealing with that right now. Yeah. And that was based on maintaining a system of chattel slavery. So what I say, and again, it's not me. I mean, I'm not just kind of making this up, but in the book, I counted up the number of clauses, and I used some fairly good scholars who had written about slavery in the Constitution. And it turns out about 25% of the Constitution, depending on how you count the number of clauses, it is devoted to preserving slavery. And most of those clauses have not been repealed.
Yeah. You're as you were talking just now, I was thinking about how often in this country decisions have been made to appease the South that have affected Black people, right? I mean, you think about Special Field Order 15, right, after the Civil War, and that attempt to right the wrongs of slavery by setting aside land for Black people so that they would be able to work that land themselves and eventually own it, and how after Lincoln's assassination, Andrew Johnson repealed that order, rescinded that order, and reconfiscated all that land that had been owned by Southern planters and took it back, right? And then you think about the way going forward to the 60s, the whole Southern strategy and appealing to, white Southerners, all with the idea of this group gets to maintain power, this group is out of power. And it's just, I just admire your thinking as a historian, how you're able to step back from all of these facts and really make these connections for your readers. I just think it's fascinating.
Well,
I
thank
wanted
you.
to ask you,
Yes.
especially, as we've said before, your book is landing at a very particular moment, and you've already talked a little bit about the way past legislation has been informed by these ideas. But in the last, few weeks, we've had new laws passed or decisions made about, first of all, you have just last week, President Biden signed the Emmett Till anti-lynching bill into law, right? And I'd love to hear what you think is the significance of that, in the context of the story you're telling. And then you also have the California Commission raising this idea that descendants of African enslaved people in California should be deserving of reparations. So can you kind of situate those two recent events against, again, what you're talking about in this book?
I certainly can. And again, thank you for asking me those questions, Natalie. Let me start by taking the second question first, and that was the question of the California state, at least the observation that just Friday, or just yesterday actually, or I think Thursday maybe, the California State Commission on looking into investigating reparations came up with one initial decision that it should be the descendants of the formerly enslaved and not just people of a certain skin color who ought to receive reparations. Now that ties in directly to something you said a moment ago that I think might have escaped many people who don't know what Special Orders 15 was. And although a lot of people will know Special Orders 15 by its more common name of 40 acres and a mule. And what most people don't know, and believe me, I learned so much about 40 acres and a mule in writing this book that I did not know. So some people know that 40 acres and a mule came as a result of Lincoln's really not sure what kind of plan he should have for slaves in terms of reparations. And since we're talking about reparations, I think going back to this moment is very, very important. Because in 1865, a plan was developed that would have given formerly enslaved people, as you said, land, and a lot of land.
400,000 acres.
It started as 400,000. What I did not know is that an additional 500,000 was added to it. It was almost 1 million acres of land that was being considered to be given to the formerly enslaved. I also did not know that General Sherman, who was basically Abraham Lincoln's representative to develop this plan, met with a group of Black ministers in South Carolina or Georgia. I can't remember exactly.
Savannah, Georgia.
Savannah. Yeah, Savannah. And he asked them, hey, what do you guys want to do? Do you want to go into the South and kind of live where you are, or do you want a separate land for yourself? And they basically said through Fraser, who was their spokesperson, we really think that the racism in the South is so bad that we want to establish our own separate community. And he said, fine, we'll do that. And that's when he issued Special Orders 15. I did not know, one, that he did that because he was afraid that Lincoln had no plan for slavery, for the formerly enslaved. So after, when Lincoln gave his next State of the Union speech after issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, basically he said, and I report this in the book, that time will heal whatever happened. Now, come on, that's no plan. That's a wish and a prayer. I also didn't know, and this just really shocked me, the South, the Confederate South, had a plan. They actually developed a plan for what to do with the formerly enslaved if they won the war. And their plan was, well, we'll give them a couple of rights, but we'll keep them basically as serfs. And that was the word that Judah Benjamin, the Secretary of State for the Confederate South, actually used. And one of the things I say in the book, which I think is really true, is, you know, the North may have won the war, but the South got their plan in operation. So here's the other piece that I think is really important. So Sherman issues Special Orders 15. He didn't include the mule in it. That came later when he said to the Army, if you've got any mules around, you know, go ahead and give them to these folks. General Otis Howard, who Howard University is named after, started distributing that land. About 40,000 formerly enslaved people got parcels of land. This is land on the East Coast from North Carolina to North Florida, basically also including the islands off the coast, the Georgia Sea Islands. This is some of the most fertile, rich land in the United States. So they're distributing it to African Americans. Lincoln gets shot. Andrew Johnson comes in. As you said, Johnson then rescinded that order, gave the land back to the former slave owners. Here's what I didn't know, Natalie. Sherman sent a letter to Johnson. And I have never read this anywhere in the history books. I just happened to find it when I was reading through the congressional records for the 39th Congress. And I came across a state representative from New York by the name of John Chanley, who entered into the records a letter from General Sherman to President Johnson that said, you know, that business about giving those Black folks land, I wasn't really serious about that. I didn't give them real title. I only wanted them out of our way so they wouldn't encumber us while we were fighting to win the war. Once we won the war, then we could figure out what to do with them. I was dumbfounded.
I've never heard that before, Clyde.
I know. Nobody's ever reported that. And that was one of the reasons, again, I said, oh my God, this is another example where this country starts down the road towards true democracy and equality and then makes an about turn really quickly when everybody is on the same side, including the people who you think may have been out there to help, like Sherman. They're actually admitting now that wasn't true. We were just kind of, we were kind of pulling a fast one on these people. So wow. Yeah, how should I say? Once again, I was so grateful to be able to report on this and to be able to pull some of this information out that no one I had ever seen had said. Mm-hmm. But it also was really sad. Mm-hmm. It was just sad to have to say that.
Well, because I think, you are pointing to moments in the history of this country where we could have done the right thing. We could have lived up to our highest ideals, and we missed an opportunity, right, as a nation to pursue these ideas that we claim we had. And imagine where we would be today. Imagine where we would be.
Natalie, that's exactly right. And if there is any theory that I'm writing to in this book, it is just what you said. To say it in Leroy Bennett's terms, whenever there was a road chosen, we as a country chose the road that led to less freedom and less democracy instead of more. And that, I think, is a really sad moment, sad thing to consider. And so you're absolutely right. And right from the beginning, remember I said in 1619, when those first Africans stepped off the boat in Virginia, there was no system of slavery they stepped into. That system was created, but it was not the only possibility. One of the possibilities, and I just quickly say this, is that those Southern planters could have decided that we're going to make an egalitarian, country here. Native Americans, the Africans who are here, yes, maybe they'll have to work for a certain period of time, but after they've worked, we are going to recompense them for the work that they have done. Yeah. That's an idea which is baked into America, actually, that you get recompense for whatever work you've done. The problem is that Africans, people of African descent, Native Americans, have worked for years, for centuries, without ever getting recompense for the kind of work they put into this country and the institutions they built as a result. That's what I wanted to bring out in the book. That's what I think I was able to do through these stories. And as I said, that's both the shock and the marvel that I had at finding out about things like this story about reparations in Sherman, where Sherman really wasn't serious to begin with. Now,
that's
the
shocking.
other question, go ahead. You were
No,
gonna say?
I've never heard that before. So I am just kind of reeling, because that has taken on such, that's a mythological story almost, among Black people, certainly, but it's part of the American narrative that, Sherman's Special Field Order 15 was kind of it represented the dawning of a new era. And so to hear that, he was not committed to that is troubling.
Yeah, it was very troubling. And look, it goes along with other things that happened about the same time. So I just give you an example of what I mean by that. General Bragg, I forget his first name, but he was a Confederate general who Fort Bragg is named after. General Bragg is from Louisiana. During the Civil War, and he had a huge plantation, he had enslaved people on that plantation. There was concern that the enslaved people on Bragg's plantation might have a rebellion that would endanger his family. So this is going to blow your mind. I'm going to have to say this twice. I had to read it 10 times. The Union Army protected Bragg's family from the enslaved people on his property, while Bragg was in North Carolina and other places killing Union soldiers.
Wow.
Can you get that? I mean, it really was hard for me to wrap my head around that. It was so important to maintain the separation between enslaved people and those who were their masters, that even the Union Army would protect those folks while the folks they were protecting were killing Union soldiers. That is the extent of kind of the warped psychology of what we see in this country in terms of race and racism.
Wow.
Yeah.
We could keep talking. I want to slip in. I'm watching the time.
Yes.
But I want to ask one last question before we go to Q&A from the folks who've tuned in. I'm thinking about the title of your book, and I am thinking about the fact that you focus on wealth. And I talk about that a little bit. Why is that part of your argument? Why is white wealth part of the story? Because you could tell this story, Clyde, and just, kind of lay out these facts, lay out these narratives, and talk about these other issues and not anchor it in this question of wealth. So why was that important to you?
It was important because one of the things you'll often hear about is people will say, I wasn't there. My ancestors never held, people enslaved. Why should I have to worry about reparations? My ancestors came to this country in the early 1900s. My ancestors came from countries which never had slavery. I have nothing to do with this system of slavery. And what I wanted to show is how wealth is intergenerational. And even if you came to this country after slavery, if you bought a home and a mortgage and had a mortgage, if you bought a car and had car insurance, if you had a credit card based on a bank that issued that credit card, you benefited from the labor that people of African descent who were enslaved put into this country. Let me be very practical and clear about that. Thomas Jefferson used his enslaved people as collateral for the debt that he owned. And I have in his hand, on my website, I've got and in his hand, the notes he wrote to his creditors saying, I'm using my enslaved people to back my loans. That created an entire industry of slave-backed mortgages. The banks that eventually we know as Chase and Wells Fargo and Citibank were based on snapping up these Southern banks who owned slaves because people defaulted on mortgages which had been backed by slaves. So the credit card you're, making that purchase with is because the bank was capable of being built on slave-backed mortgages. It's horrible. And it goes much further than that. And I talked about some of that, in my book. The entire insurance industry, Aetna, AIG, you name all the major insurance carriers, they issued slave-backed insurance. I'm going to insure your slave in case the enslaved person you have dies or is incapable of work. That built the insurance industry. Wall Street, investment, the ability to invest in certain kinds of financial products was based on this idea of packaging slave mortgages, using them as derivatives. And I even use that name, and I talk about this a little bit more in the book and try to give examples of that, so that if you've invested in Wall Street, you're investing in an institution which was built based on the unrecompensed labor and bodies of people of African descent. I think that's important to know, not to make people feel guilty, but to make people understand or help them understand that everybody doesn't benefit in the same way from a system which is inequitable to begin with.
Yeah, that's you've given us lots of food for thought here. I'm again so happy that you have dug into this topic and are presenting people with the true story. I would love to have us go to some questions. We have just about 11 minutes left. Claire, are there any questions that have come in from the audience?
There are questions. I'm just trying to kind of trying to gather my thoughts here. I mean, Clyde, you've revealed so much here tonight, and a lot of the questions kind of touch on things that you already addressed. So what I'm going to try to do, because we don't have very much time, is sort of look at the questions that, well, there's one in particular that I'm thinking of that sort of comes out of what you were just talking about. Julie says, materialism and greed make the ones in power very crafty. How can we try to correct our current unchecked greed and try to save the children from becoming like the parent? Some people cannot comprehend that we are living in a country that succeeded off slave power. So although your relatives never owned slaves, you live in a country that was made great because of this. So I think that question is, like you said, so many of these systems, insurance, mortgages, all of that, were created with this as their foundation. How can we correct that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think at this point, the light that I see is what happened in California, where they first, where Governor Newsom established a commission to look into the questions of reparations. They're moving ahead. I'm a big believer in the whole idea of truth and reconciliation. And I think the one way that you ensure yourself not solving it is by not talking about it, but by talking about an issue, it's a way to solve that issue. I think truth and reconciliation is a process. I think the Reparations Commission is going through those stages. But the one thing about any type of a truth and reconciliation process is you have to start by telling the truth. And that's what I hope a book like this lends itself to, is telling the truth about history so we can have an honest discussion that might move us to a stage where we can, for example, follow through on the promise that was reneged to people of African descent in 1865 about reparations. And I think California Commission knows that the eyes of the nation and probably the eyes of the world are looking at them, and they're making, I think, they're having tough discussions, making some decisions. I'm really pleased to see that. I think that is one of the ways we move forward, by a commission like what we see in California, which will, look at how do you establish reparations for people of color. I think another thing that I would love to hear, I don't know if I'll ever get to hear it in my lifetime, but I would love to hear someone like President Biden issue a statement that says slavery was wrong, the country should never have been involved with it, and make an apology for that. I think that would be huge, just in and of itself, as a statement. Now, other people have. I think even the British have gone a little bit further, although not totally, but I think they have. I mean, recently, part of the monarchy was in Jamaica, where once again, they reiterated the belief that slavery was not something that the British Empire should have been involved in, although they didn't say anything about reparations for the millions and billions and probably now trillions of dollars that the monarchy made. So Truth and Reconciliation, reparations commissions, I think that's some practical steps. Learning how to talk about difficult issues like race and racism, that's a personal thing that I think people can do. And those are some ways we can move forward.
It was interesting, something that you said early on. I mean, I've been struck by a lot of things that you said, but you were talking about at the very beginning how you can't, when discussing critical race theory, you can't legislate based on people's feelings. Yeah, how could that? Just doesn't make any sense. But anyway, so we do have a question from Rupert, who says, D.L. Hewley said, quote, "Ultimately, America is aspirational. Obama is what we would like to be. Donald Trump and his supporters is who we are," end quote. Do you agree? And how do we get past myth and accept truth?
Wow, that's a really packed question. Let me say this, as a mythologist, and you may know, Claire, that I've written some books, or at least one book on mythology. I don't like the use of the word myth in that context, although I do understand why we use it that way, because I think myth actually provides these beautiful templates for how to move forward as a society, although I do understand the use of the word myth in this context. I think, again, it's kind of, I'm repeating myself to say that the way we move forward is by recognizing the kind of society we are and then taking the steps that might change it. I have to say, one of the things that saddens me in the last several elections is that the popular vote did not put the person into office. And so I'm one who is a big believer in getting rid of the filibuster in the Senate, which is based also on slavery and the desire of Southern senators to be able to filibuster or prevent bills against slavery from going forward. I'm also a big believer in getting rid of the Electoral College. I think that if we had a popular democracy, which we do not, although some of us think we do, then we would be able to elect people who better reflected the values of this country. So if we had a popular democracy, Trump would not have been in office. If we had a popular democracy, Bush would not have been in office, Gore would have. And if we look back at that, I think that should be enough to scare us, some of us, into really working hard to eliminate the Electoral College and to eliminate the filibuster.
Thank you. Let's see. So I think, so you've already spoken to the second part of this question, but I'll read the whole thing. Virginia says, I wondered two things. First, how the killing of George Floyd affected you as you were writing this book. And second, can you speak to H.R. 40 establishing a commission to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans? So you've just talked at length about the notion of reparations, but please feel free to address the whole thing. So questions on how the killing of George Floyd affected your writing, and then the second part about reparations.
Sure. So let me answer the first part in a little bit more in depth. I kept thinking when I saw that horribly iconic image of Derek Chauvin's knee on George Floyd's neck, that image evoked something in me. I had seen it before. And I wasn't thinking of other African-American men who had been, in some way had the life choked out of them by a policeman. I kept thinking, where have I seen this image? Where have I seen this image? And then I finally realized, and I do talk about this in the book, that I had seen this image in connection with a biblical passage, and that the image that I had seen was of a king with his foot on the neck of one of his enemies, with the inscription in several biblical passages that it was absolutely okay to put your foot on the neck of your enemies. This is from the Old Testament, which, as you know, is a very violent kind of a book about what to do with your enemies. And so I kept thinking, oh my God, this is much older than even the folks who are talking about defund the police and police reform. This idea that there is an us versus them, and that there are vanquishing forces, that once you conquer the them, you can do whatever you want, goes back deep. It goes back deeper than this country. It goes back into deep in European and into the Middle East in terms of this whole biblical understanding. That opened up, and I have a whole chapter on this in the book, Virginia, that opened up this whole question for me of, where does policing come from? And I have to say, when I did the research there, I know that it's popular this day and age to say policing comes from slave patrols. Yes, it does. But it's much deeper than that. Policing in America comes from some ideas in Britain in the 13th century, that have not changed. We even use the same words to describe wards and watches and all sorts of other stuff that actually come to us from a statute called the Statute of Winchester in 1285. Policing manuals talk about going back to that statute. It's all about identifying who is the in-group and who is the out-group, and the in-group controlling, patrolling, and basically articulating what the out-group can and cannot do. And again, I'm giving you kind of a shortened version of this. I went into writing that chapter thinking about George Floyd and thinking about how police reform needs to happen. I came away from that chapter believing police reform is not going to happen. We need to totally rethink the basis of policing in this country. It needs to be be situated far away from this idea of us versus them, where the police are protecting the us and people of color are the them. We've got to rethink this completely. And I really ended up feeling reform is not the answer. Reform is tinkering around the margins of a system that is not going to change. We need to actually reset the entire system. And that's why I think it's really important for us to push in these ways to make sure that we're not just funding the police to do the same thing better, but that we're rethinking policing so that we're not creating the environment that would simply perpetuate the problems that we see. So I have answered the second part of that question on reparations and HR 40. So if there are some other questions, let's go on from there, because I know we're limited in our time. Although, Claire, I'll stay for anybody that wants to stay. I'll stay as long as Natalie is able to stay and you're able to stay. I'm willing to have this discussion because it's certainly an important and interesting discussion for me.
Yes, and I agree on the importance and the interesting part. However, I will also say that I am pretty certain that we could talk about this all night long.
Yes, and so let's do limited to some degree.
All right, so how about, let's see, we are going to take one more question.
Okay.
So Amaret says, and you also touched on this a little bit earlier, I'm so glad you wrote this. I have been curious about it for a long time. I would like to know, what were some of the resources you used for your research, how difficult the research was, and if you came across any surprises along the way? You have certainly shared some surprises with us that you learned about.
Yes. Well, first of all, having done this research early on as a college student when there was no internet, and you had to go to source material like in the Virginia Historical Archives in Richmond, and I thumbed through some of those archives years and years ago. The difference is amazing. I mean, there is so much available through the internet that just was not available to me doing this original work early on. What I tried to do was to use original sources as much as I can. And for the web, and the book has a companion website, www.ofbloodandsweat.com, in which I actually give some of that source material in supplements to the book. I actually show you the documents that I went to. You can see images of, for example, Thomas Jefferson's writing in his own hand about using his slaves to back his mortgages. So I tried to use source material whenever I could. I thought that was really important. When I couldn't use source material, then I went to secondary material. For example, I used the work of, my dear friend, Leron Bennett, often when source material just wasn't available, and I wanted the opinion of some other writers on a particular topic. It was fairly easy to do source material work. Now with the internet, there's some great archives that you can use. The federal government has really good archives. All of the WPA writers, the Writers Project from the 1930s, the Depression is there. There are original recordings of African Americans who were enslaved people. So you can listen to some of them, you can read the transcripts, and those were a great help. The Congress, obviously the Congressional Register keeps reports of the Congress. Again, just amazed me that other historians hadn't read and discovered some of the material that I had discovered in reading that material. So I did go to places like the Congressional Register. The book has somewhere around 650 references in the reference section for each chapter. So I tried to document this as well as I could for anyone who might be interested in looking at the source material that I looked at to come up with their own conclusions about this work. I will say this, the only challenge in the internet age is because you do and you go to a reference today, it doesn't mean that that institution or agency will keep the same URL, that is the internet address, tomorrow. So a lot of the references that you're going to find in my book, you may not be able to get to that page right now because it's been changed. There's a couple of ways that you can work with that. One of the ways to do that is just go to a search engine and type out the search terms related to that reference. The way that I often did it when that was a problem for me is there is something called the Wayback Machine, in which you can enter a search URL, an internet address, for a specific year. And this Wayback Machine has captured basically a picture of the internet for 2020, for example. I did the research in August of 2020. So anything that you can't find today, you can go to the Wayback Machine, enter the URL that's in the book, but make sure that it's entered for August 2020. And there's a good chance you'll find exactly what I saw using that reference. So there, if you want to take the time, you can get to whatever reference I use to come up with the kind of reporting that I did in the book.
That's fascinating. I've never, the Wayback Machine?
Wayback Machine, yes.
Okay. Wow. Thank you for sharing that with us. Well, I think we've come to the end. But I just want to thank you both so much. Thank you, Natalie, for being a fabulous moderator, and Clyde, of course, as always. We love hosting you for your launches, and I did put the link in the chat to the Village Books website where both of our authors' books are listed. You can get Natalie's books and Clyde's books right there in one easy spot. And of course, we have autographed copies of Blood and Sweat. And if you're in Bellingham and you purchase the book in store at Village Books, we do have a special treat for you. We cooperated with the cafe that's located within Village Books, Evolve Chocolate and Cafe, and they have provided some delicious cookies that are very special. So if you purchase a copy at Village Books that you pick up at the store, you will be handed a gorgeous, delicious peanut butter chocolate chip gluten-free cookie. So,
And they are yummy, I can tell you. They are really good.
yes,
Natalie,
yes.
Claire, I want to thank you. Natalie, thank you so much
My pleasure.
for partnering with me in this conversation. I hope we can do it again because we just started to scratch the surface.
I know. And congratulations again, Clyde.
Thanks.
Oh, we're seeing in the chat, Queen Sugar is awesome, says Julie.
Yay! And I know that, I don't know if I can say this, but I know Natalie's working on a new book, and I can only think that that's even going to be more awesome because writers like wine get better as they age.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that vote of confidence. I'll take it.
All right. Well, thank you to our audience for joining us this evening. This recording will be on YouTube within hopefully 24 hours. And thank you to my guests. Everybody, stay well and good night.
Thank you, Claire. Thanks everybody for joining us. And again, Natalie, take care.
My
Bye
pleasure.
now.
Bye-bye.